Hey folks, Canadian Computer Collector here. This week we're doing something a bit different. My brother has put together a special for us where he builds a budget PC for under $250. So this is especially good if you're one of the youngins out there who's looking to get into owning a computer. Things are possible with the power of used PC parts. If you like what you see, don't forget to like and subscribe, and don't forget that I have a light not 6 inches from my eye.
Yeah. Hi, Stacy Hewen here for Canadian Computer Collector, and we're going to be giving Dan a break this week, and we're going to see just how much computer we can get on the used market on the cheap. Alright, now I'm pretty sure that we all know the answer, which is not much, because let's be honest with ourselves, the used market is crap because the new market is crap. We're going to have to be real. It ain't what it was a year ago. Nowadays, if you want anything, you're going to have to go out and really scrimp and look for deals, and you end up with what we have in front of us. So in front of me, we have a GTX 460 that I got for $20. Now the trick to this one is you don't look for the graphics card name or look for even the word graphics card or anything like that. When you're looking on the used market, you want to look for complete tower PCs. Maybe you're working, maybe you're not, but you can see a graphics card in it. So in this case, I found one. It had no hard drive. They said the computer was working, but they removed the hard drive, so chances are probably broken. And they said it had a 960 in it. Nothing else, just 960. Upon further inspection, it's a GTX 460. So I managed to get the whole tower for 20 bucks, rip the graphics card out. I have tested it, it does work. So you got a 1 gigabyte graphics card for 20 bucks. That's actually not super unreasonable. Now, on the unreasonable side, we got the R9 270 that I picked up for the equivalent of about $75 US. I bought this one used locally. It's a 2 gigabyte graphics card. Was a decent card in its day, but if I'm being honest, nowadays, I mean, 75 bucks is pretty steep. Some people asking, 125, 150, some even $200. Those people are nuts. And I know that there's a bit of a meth crisis across the country, and I'm wondering if that's contributing to the graphics card prices. We got a laptop hard drive, 500 gigabytes. Let's be real, you probably shouldn't be paying anything for this, especially if it's 5400 RPM. Got a 1 terabyte, 7200 RPM laptop hard drive that I took out of my gaming laptop when I swapped a SSD in there in place of the storage drive. These again, $20, $30, $40, 50 bucks if you're a real sucker. And then we have the real prize for today, i7-3770K. I got this bad boy for about $40 Canadian, so about $30 US. No cooler, but I did get myself
a real beefy knock to a dual tower cooler
for about 10 bucks on the used market. Once again though, there's going to be compromises. In that case, it was because it only had the Intel mounting hardware. Well, that's great because we're only going to be mounting this to an Intel system. Now, Intel made pretty much the only decent CPUs for the better part of a decade, and that's why everything was so stagnant for so long, why everything only had 4 cores. That means that we also have a decade where Moore's Law doesn't come into effect, so we can actually squeak out something that can play some modern games on low resolutions or some older games on high res. Our goal with this one really is just to see how much performance we can squeeze out. And before we get started, first thing we're going to want to do is to clean out the computer and just test it to see if what we got works. Alright, so the first thing any PC enthusiast or genetically engineered towel should have on hand
is an air duster.
This computer is very dusty. I've already given it a once over with the air duster, but it still needs a lot more. Real trick, go from top to bottom, hold fan blades in place so you don't damage anything, and let's go! So now that we've cleaned a decade of somebody else's dead skin cells and pet fur and also scared the absolute out of my cat, we can see what exactly we got for the 150 Canadian dollars or just over 100 US dollars that we spent. We got our i5 2500 with the stock cooler. We have 16 gigabytes of all Kingston DDR3 RAM, halfway decent motherboard. We've got a 600 watt power supply from Thermaltake, so at least it's a brand I recognize. No storage, of course. And that's about it. With this Cooler Master case, I would say that all in all, this is a win. I'm going to put some storage in here, and then we're going to get ready to install Windows and test it out. Make sure that everything we got does work, because right now I'm just operating
off of the goodwill of men.
So the first thing that we're going to want to do before we do anything else is put some storage in this computer so we can install an operating system, in this case it's Windows, and test to see if what we got works before we've sullied it by adding any of our own hardware. Assuming that you don't have other test benches with which to test the hardware, what you should be doing is testing the machine itself and then each component individually by adding them one at a time.
Well, we have liftoff. Oof. Well, we clearly have a bad fan. That is rough. All right. We are finally able to start checking to see if we actually got what we paid for. So, nice, easy way and easy to read place is to check. We got 16 gigabytes of RAM, i5 3570K. Okay, that's actually much better than what I was told was in here. I was told this was an i5 2500, so score. Let's see what we got. Got some old pictures of Dan with his old cat.
So that's one of the other fun things about building computers with old or found parts, is going through some of the old storage drives to see what you got.
We are ready to do a little bit of surgery.
Now, if you've never built a computer before, this part can feel like the most nerve-wracking, but for people who have built computers before, this part is the most fun. So we're going to take off the old CPU cooler and fan there that was making that awful noise, and we're going to release it by pinching through these little tabs on the back, and then we're going to pull it from the front after we've loosened and unplugged the CPU fan from the motherboard. Now we're going to clean off all of the thermal paste there. The old stuff will be no good. You don't want to reuse it, so just get some high percentage isopropyl alcohol and then rub it off. Personally, I like to use it on a paper towel, but you can also use Q-tips. Now we're going to be installing the new cooler here, so we have to take the back plate and push it through where the old cooler went. Since this is the Intel mounting hardware, we are going to use the instructions as were found in the Noctua cooler box. Luckily they were included. As we put the mounting brackets on here, you see I have to hold it from the back side, which can be a little bit hard if you have smaller arms, but luckily I don't. And we're going to screw these in, and since they're two per, it doesn't really matter which side. But once we put the cooler on, it actually does matter a little bit more the angle from which you approach this. So you put it on top, and then you put the mounting screws in there, and you can see I'm going from side to side there, trying to make sure that the pressure remains even as I put it in. If there's four, you want to go from corner to corner. You don't want to get it too heavily in on one side before the other. As we place the graphics card in here, it's pretty simple. Just place it in the PCIe slot and then tighten it down with some screws, and then put the power cables from the power supply into the graphics card. And now we're ready to get into some gaming.
I didn't end up using the GTX 460 that I mentioned earlier in the video, because once I did some benchmarking, I found that the performance wasn't really adequate. But for $20, it's better than integrated graphics, but that's about it. I found that the best value from this came from buying the computer that was complete. It was advertised as an i5 2500K, which is actually still a decent processor, but we ended up with an i5 3570K. So I decided to not use the i7 3770K that I had bought for this project. The 3570K is more than adequate. You only lose hyperthreading and a couple percentage points of performance. So I actually just sold that off to keep the costs of the project down.
All right, we are going to get into some benchmarks now. We're going to start with CSGO. Counter-Strike Global Offensive is a very popular esports title, so it seems like a pretty apt one to begin with. And in the opening screen, which oftentimes can be challenging for lower-end computers, we're getting over 100 FPS, which is fantastic. So we're going to be joining a game, and normally I wouldn't show the loading screen, but one of the biggest trade-offs you're going to have here is using a spinning disk hard drive to store your games on, most likely, unless you have access to cheap SSDs, or that's just something that you don't want to scrimp on, and that's fine. But you'll see here that it takes a better part of about a minute to get into a game, but once the game actually loads, we're going to see that the frame rate is actually quite tolerable. So we're getting over 100 frames per second here. I assume if you're building a cheap computer, you probably have a 60 hertz refresh rate monitor anyway, so you're going to be targeting about 60 FPS. And we're just going to pwn some nubs while we're here. So moving on, we're at F1 2021 now. And I decided that this game would actually be a great way to demonstrate the gains that you can get between running on low, medium, high, etc. So on ultra low, we averaged 86 FPS. You're really going to be targeting the low end of the FPS, so the minimum FPS. We got 57 there when we cranked from ultra low to low. But it's going to be most important because that's where you're going to experience the stutters and the dips is on the low end. So once we got that up to low in the rain, we see a minimum of 49, but still averaging 66 FPS. Rain is going to be the one that's hardest on the system in a racing game. And then up to medium, we got an average of 59 FPS with a minimum of 45. Honestly, that's not bad, and in most games that would be acceptable, but in a racing game where precision is so important, having a stutter could absolutely ruin an entire race if it happens at the wrong time. So you're probably going to want to go for a setting which targets around 60 FPS on the minimum. So for our final benchmark, we're going to be using Rocket League, which is another common esports title. And the nice thing about this is it'll run on anything, including a Nintendo Switch. So you know that most computers should be able to run it. By switching everything to the performance setting instead of quality, we find that we're going to get a locked 30 frames per second, which is tolerable. If you played the Nintendo 64, it targeted 30 frames per second. Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild also targets 30 frames per second. So it's not going to meaningfully reduce your experience here. It may make you slightly less competitive, as they say, frames win games, and a higher refresh rate, especially in a competitive title, is going to be important if you're playing at the absolute top end, where it's super important that you have the most up-to-date information at the soonest possible moment. But if you're just a casual player like myself, you can see that 30 frames per second is just fine. I tried changing the frame rate up to 60 frames per second, and you'll notice that we're getting dips into the 50s, especially when you're on the goal screen there after somebody scores. But as long as we change things around a little bit, start playing with the quality, dropping it to performance, which is an interesting way of saying low quality, but I appreciate it because it helps people who may not be super familiar with changing settings, explain what you're going to be going for here.
Alrighty folks, there you have it. How much gaming PC we could put together for under $250 in the current market. It wasn't great. We were playing games on low or ultra low or performance settings, but it also wasn't awful. We're including the cost of the storage to be rough on this one because, like most things, you can just scavenge a small SSD or old spinning disk hard drives from laptops or old desktop computers. So you can easily get yourself 500 gigs to a terabyte of storage. For under $250, not bad, but do I think this was a meaningfully better gaming experience than buying a Nintendo Switch? No. I'd go out on the used market and I would buy myself a Nintendo Switch before I spent my money building a gaming PC like this. But if I needed a workstation or if I needed a computer for other reasons like video editing, for example, this would provide you with an adequate computer that's going to be better than spending that money on the new market. If you're looking to game, you'll be able to have an okay gaming experience, but you're not going to be playing modern AAA titles at anything above low. At the end of the day, I really do think that the Nintendo Switch or a similar console for the price, maybe you can buy yourself a PS4 or an Xbox One for about that money, you're going to be better off if all you're looking to do is gaming. And if you like what you saw here today, let me know. Put it in the comments if you'd like to see us do any other projects like this, or if you'd like to see us do stuff with the used market or more modern things. Really interested to know, and I think you're really going to enjoy what Dan has coming up for you in the future. In the meantime, I'm not the Canadian computer collector, but I am his brother.
Scout has some opinions. He doesn't think anybody should be gaming at 30 frames per second.